This lecture is going to pick up where we left off last time with discussing the changing roles of man within the Renaissance. Now, we left off talking about the Arnolfini marriage, or Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride by Jean van Eyck. And we said this taught us different things about the Renaissance. Number one, it shows the rising middle class, the rising merchant class. Here we have Arnolfini and his bride with all of the trappings of their wealth around them. And remember, Arnolfini is a merchant in this. Also, this was very important because we talked about the changing role of the artist, that the artist is no longer just looked at as the technician or as copying, but here with Van Eyck literally placing himself within the work and the reflection in the mirror, and with the word Jean Van Eyck was here, it changes the role of the artist, and the artist now becomes a witness, and it's a witness to the events of the day and what is happening in the work. We're going to see that continued in other works such as this. This is Albrecht Dürer's. He was German, and this is his Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, 1497 and 98, and it is a woodcut. Here, it's focusing on the medieval superstitions, right? The myth of the horsemen come, it's the end times. But what's very interesting here is he's actually making a very political statement of the times within the work. If you look, the four horsemen are trampling the individuals, trampling the humans, but we also see some of the fall of the church being depicted in this. And we see that if you look in the bottom left, there's actually a bishop that is also being trampled. And so this is alluding to some of the turmoil that's developing in the church at the time. Now with the sculpture, again, we're still in the early Renaissance here. Early Renaissance wanting to show the world as it actually is, and that we see this very clearly in Donatello's David. David, most of us are, when we think David, are more familiar with Michelangelo's David, which we will get to shortly, but Donatello's is the early Renaissance. And if you look at this figure, most people look at this David and he looks more feminine. Well, the reason behind that is because in the Bible, David is described as a beautiful youth. So Donatello here is showing David as he actually was at the time. And so the male form, before it reached maturity, more closely, it's a little more feminine in nature. And that's what it's being shown here. The architecture of the time, we're going to see advancements from the Gothic period. Remember Gothic cathedrals, where we had these very tall, massive open structures. But the frame wasn't able to hold the structures up on its own, so it had to have things such as the flying buttresses. Here, what we're going to see in the architecture is that the structures themselves are going to be more supportive. And so you don't have to have these additional outside elements to add the support. Instead, any outside elements are basically there just for more decoration. And we see that in the example here. This is Filippo Brunelleschi's. This is the dome of the Florence Cathedral. All right. Well, we're going to take a moment here and we're going to talk about some very important happenings in the church. And what happens is we're going to have the Protestant Reformation. So what happens in the Protestant Reformation? It's 1517, and more people are getting upset with the church. We've already talked about the idea of, buying forgiveness through the buying of indulgences, and then the Pope was becoming more and more powerful. And most people started to look at the Pope as actually being the voice of God. Well, what happens in 1517, Martin Luther writes his 95 Theses, and he literally goes up and he hammers it into the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. And you have to remember, this was a very bold move because those in the past who had challenged the church often were called heretics and things did not end very well for them. But what happens with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, it's basically listing the discord that many people felt with the Catholic Church. And because of this, we have this massive split in the church, and Protestantism develops. And what Protestantism does is it calls for a return to the text, a return to the scripture, not looking and depending on this kind of bureaucracy that the church has developed over the past century. Past 1,000 years. With this, they call to look at the scripture itself And it's also challenging the role of the Pope. The idea is that the Pope is not the voice of God, right? Because God is infallible, doesn't make mistakes. Well, man, the Pope, is fallible, therefore it cannot be the voice of God. Now, they do say the Pope is the leader of the church, but that's it. He is a man who is the head of the organization. Also, Protestantism looks at artwork a little differently, where the church had been building using these great forms of art, which we're going to see more here in the High Renaissance. What happens in Protestantism, it's not that art is banned, but art is not to be used like idols, like as a substitution. So on the slide you see here, this is Raphael's album Madonna. Within this, you wouldn't look at it and worship the figures within it. What Protestantism says is that you can have artwork as long as it chooses to help teach the message of the scriptures. And so because of this, we're going to see this weakening of the church because of this great split of the Protestant Reformation. Well, what happens as we move into the High Renaissance, again, 1495, 1527, a little bit, again, squishy on those dates, but we're going to continue to see some of the ideas of the early Renaissance continue on. We're still going to have this idea of the return to the classical ideals of Greece and Rome, but what's going to happen here, where the early Renaissance focused on showing the world as it actually was, and the High Renaissance, we're going to see this idealism through a mathematical influence, and this idea of perfect proportions and having the math in the composition of the work itself. And you can clearly see this in the image here. Again, this is Raphael's album Madonna. What happens in this, you can see a very clear central equilateral triangle. So if you start in the bottom left hand and you go up the back of John the Baptist through Jesus to the top of Mary's head, follow the line downward, down her back, and then connect them, you clearly see an equilateral triangle. And that's an example of how we see this perfection within the works themselves. Now, what's interesting during this time period is that the church, the Catholic Church, is responding to the Protestant Reformation. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring more influence back into, more people back into the church. What we're going to see in the High Renaissance is we're actually going to shift from Florence to Rome. And this was largely due to the popes and their supports of the art in Rome, or more specifically, what's known as the Vatican. This is the time period where Pope Nicholas starts the building of St. Peter's Basilica, including what is now known as the Vatican Library. And so Athens, the idea, instead of Florence being the new Athens, the idea was now that Athens had been reborn in Rome. And here we're going to see St. Peter's, such as St. Peter's Basilica. This originally had various different architects. Michelangelo actually became the chief architect after criticizing some of the plans, and he actually went back to the original architect's idea because he said it was plain and clear and pure and full of life and representing the truth. It was completed in May of 1590, but the total completion of the square, the plaza out front, was not done until 1614. Also within the High Renaissance, we're going to see more of these ideas of capturing the classical ideas, but they didn't want to exactly copy them. Again, it was more of that mathematical composition and proportions within the work. And what we're going to see very important in the Renaissance is this idea of exploration continuing. So it's a time of continued discovery. I think it's 1522 when Magellan circumnavigates the globe. We also get the printing press invented during this time period, which makes books more easily printed, makes them cheaper, makes it available for more people. So we're going to see more people beginning to become literate. This is the time of Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. He wrote his On the Revolutions of Celestial Bodies in 1543, and this is where he claimed that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun, that we live in a heliocentric universe, not a geocentric universe where the Earth was the center and everything revolved around it, as was put out by the church. So this is directly against the church teachings. In fact, this book was considered so dangerous that in 1606, it was placed on the index of prohibited books. But We'll see it again soon in the Enlightenment. Also, this is the time of Francis Bacon, 1562 to 1626. Bacon advocated for the scientific method. If you don't remember, scientific method, if you remember, in 6th grade you had to do the science fair projects, most of the time you did it using the scientific method. This is where you claim actual observations need to be made. So, for example, you say, oh, well, do plants need water to survive? So you take 4 plants and you feed one water, you feed one orange juice, you feed one milk, and you feed one pop, and then you see what happens to them over time. You have your hypothesis, which basically is your claim of what's going to happen. So do plants need water? Well, you might make the claim, well, this one and this one might be okay, but I'm going to conclude that the plant that gets fed the water is actually going to do the best. Then what do? You test it, and then you either prove or disprove your hypothesis. And the reason this is so important is because with the scientific method, it's advocating for actual observation, not just relying on things because they've always been that way or that's why we've always believed, right? What we're looking at here, this is Raphael Santiago School of Athens. It was painted 1501 to 1504. And this was part of the commissionings of the popes. Again, the popes would call some of the great artists into Rome. This is where, we'll talk in a second, the Sistine Chapel is being painted. Well, what we see here, probably Raphael's most famous frescoes, these are in the Stanza della Stegnatoria, which literally means the room of the signature. And what this room is this is the room the popes would go in and sign the important papal documents, basically making church law. And so it's very interesting what he painted on this. If you look at this closely, again, it's a fresco, so it's the painted wall, it's in the plaster. And what we see here is this is a gathering of the great thinkers of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's also being watched over by 2 gods. Look at the sculptures in the back. On the left, you have Apollo, who's the god of truth, music, and poetry. To the right is Athena, the goddess of wisdom and reason. In the center in the archway, you see Plato pointing upwards, talking about his idealized forms. And Aristotle is pointing downwards, concerning more with materiality in this realm. The man sprawled on the steps is Socrates. In the lower left corner, you see Pythagoras. Remember the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. On the far right, the individual holding the globe, that's Ptolemy, who was a Roman math, geographer, and astronomer. The man with the slate and the compass, that's Euclid, who's the Greek father of geometry. The man in the foreground drawing, that's Heraclitus, who was also a Greek philosopher. And so we have in here, we have this collection of the great thinkers of the past. Now this is very interesting because you have to remember where we're at. We're in a room in the Vatican. We're in a room, the seat of the Catholic Church, and here is this great fresco paying homage to these pagans. Also very interesting within this, Raphael actually put in who he considered the great thinkers of his own time. If you go back up and look at Plato pointing in the back, pointing up, that's actually Leonardo. And then the man drawing on the front, that's actually Michelangelo. And then if you look to the far right in the gathering of men, right before where the arch really starts, you see this little face peeking out, peering at the viewer. That's Raphael himself, right? So it's the great thinkers of the past and the great thinkers of today. Well, very interestingly enough, this is the fresco directly across from it. This is the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. Basically what it is it's looking at the structure of the church. So when we see the bottom, here we have humans, right? Humans in the church itself. You can see the Pope sat there, and they're actually paying homage to the church. As you go up, when we see the dove, that represents the Holy Spirit. Here we see Jesus sitting on the throne judging, Mary to his left, Mary on the left, John the Baptist on the right, and then we see the man, the figure of God, ruling over all of it. So here we have this fresco, which seems to be celebrating the greatness of the church. And it's very interesting when we think about their juxtaposition. We have this directly across them at the School of Athens. And we have to think about what Raphael is doing within this room. When we look at the School of Athens, if I asked you if it was based more on faith or reason, you're probably going to say it's based more on reason. Yet when we look at the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, this one seems to be based more on faith. And that's exactly what Michelangelo is doing, is he's wanting the popes, as they're in this room signing these important documents, basically creating church law, he wants them to remember this idea that it's a balance between faith and reason, that one should not always control over the other. And this gets into some of these ideas of Renaissance humanism that we're going to discuss in a moment. Here also we see the idea, Michelangelo's David. He is, again, one of the great three Florentine artists. This was 1501 to 1504. And we've already talked about this was intended to be on top of the Florence Cathedral. You can see here I was talking about, the mathematical correctness and proportions. This David is intentionally out of proportion. The hands are so large because they're very important to the story. Michelangelo was one of the artists who really didn't abide by the mathematical perceptions of the High Renaissance. He just basically said the math will speak itself. But we hear again this idealized form. When you look at David's body, clearly Michelangelo had a deep understanding of the human anatomy and skeletal structure. And so we see that very clearly in the work. Also with Michelangelo in 1505, Pope Julius II commissioned him to finish the Sistine Chapel that Pope Sixtus IV had started. When we think about the Sistine Chapel, we usually just think about the ceiling. We have to remember there were other frescoes painted in there. There was a series of frescoes painted by Botticelli and a series of frescoes painted by Parmigiano. Then we have Michelangelo's ceiling. Later, Michelangelo's Last Judgment comes a little bit later in time. He did not paint at the same time he did the ceiling. All right, well now let's move on more specifically to this idea of Renaissance humanism. And what we're going to see we're going to see it very clearly in the work that I show you here. Now, this work is not in your textbook, so I would pay close attention here. This painting is called The Ambassadors, and it was painted by Hans Holbein, Holbein the Younger. 1533, it is an oil on oak. Now, Hans Holbein himself, he was German, and he became very well known for his portraiture work. In fact, he became the court painter to Henry VIII. And he was known because he always made his the people sitting there look very dignified within the works themselves. Well, what we're looking at here is we are actually looking at two wealthy, educated, powerful young men. On the left is Jean de Ventel, who is the French ambassador to England in 1533. On the right is Georges de Saville, who was the Bishop of Lavaur. And so what we see, these two men, their jobs are as ambassadors. They are looking directly back at the viewer. This is very important because we see this with this sense of confidence and this unquestioning self-awareness. But what's very important also within the work is all of the objects in the works themselves. And what these represent, these are the tools of the time. In the Renaissance, this idea of becoming a Renaissance man, many of you have probably heard this term, and what it means to be a Renaissance man is to be kind of a jack of all trades, that you're not just educated or a specialist in one area, but that you are educated in many different areas, including the 7 liberal arts, which include the math and sciences. Also, you would be able to be a good dancer. You probably played a musical instrument. You were able to speak eloquently. You were probably a very good public speaker. And so all of these things are celebrated. And what happens is, again, this idea of Renaissance humanism. Now, humanism itself isn't a new idea, but it was one that wasn't greatly explored before this time. So humanism itself is basically a growing concern with the natural world, with the individual's existence in the world. What we see then with this idea of Renaissance humanism that begins in the 14th century and fully blossoms in the 15th century, is this idea that individuals should be judged on their own merits. So think about, we've talked about the Middle Ages, right? Think about how classes were structured. If you were born a serf, you probably remained a serf. If you were born in the upper classes, you probably remained in the upper classes. And as each, you had different avenues open to you. Most serfs were illiterate. Why? Because they weren't educated. What happens in the idea of Renaissance humanism is that we begin looking at the individual and individual potential. The idea is that if we take all men and give them the same opportunities, then we can judge them based on what they do with them. So if everybody has the same education, then we see somebody flourish and somebody not. That is how they should be judged. And this is a radical change in thinking. Also, we see within Renaissance humanism this development of this idea of civic virtue, meaning you need to be involved in the state and see the importance of the civic life, what's otherwise known as the greater good, over the individual wants or needs. That self-sacrificing service to the state, participation in government, defense of state institutions is much better than personal misfortune. So think of it this way. In times of war, right, do you really want to go sign up for the army? Probably not. Why? Because there's a chance you might die. But you have this civic duty to do what? What's good for the greater good. And this would be to defend the state. And so that's part of this Renaissance humanism. So it's looking at the individual, judging the individual based on their own merits, looking and see what they do with their own potential. And then again, this idea of civic duty, right? Now, you're going to see these ideas reflected in the painting here. So when you look at the objects on the table, right, these objects represent the tools of the Renaissance man. So you can see things on the upper shelf, including we see a celestial globe. That is for tracking the planets and the stars. There's a portable sundial, and various other instruments for understanding the heavens and measuring time. On the lower level, there is a terrestrial globe showing, again, that's the terrestrial means land, showing exploration. Interestingly enough, if you look at it, Rome is actually the center of the world. There's a case of flutes there. There are two different texts, two different books. The instrument that looks like a guitar, that's actually a lute. So all of these things actually represent the 7 liberal arts, and they're the tools of the individual. They wanted themselves shown with this, right? Why? So they could show that they were the learned men. We also can tell they're very wealthy. Number one, they're having a portrait painted. And look at the clothing itself. Even the bishop's clothing, very, very thick and luxurious. The floor shows us that it's, expensive inlaid marble. The curtain in the back, very rich and luxurious. And even the objects on the upper shelf seem to be sitting on some sort of rug that probably came from more of the Eastern world, which is again showing travel and exploration. So this painting does seem to be celebrating all of these ideals of Renaissance humanism. Yet there's also a darker side within the work. There was turmoil, there was political turmoil at this time period, and Holbein shows that within the work itself. Some have argued that the separation, right, remember the one on the left is the ambassador to the state, the one on the right is an ambassador from the church, that maybe this is showing this separation of faith and reason, the separation within the church itself. If we look closely, the strings of the lute are actually broken. So if we have a musical instrument that is not working, it's going to represent discord and disharmony. Also, the two textbooks. The two books are very interesting. One is a textbook for merchants. It's mathematics for merchants, and it's printed using the printing press. And then the other is a book of hymns. And very interesting enough, the hymn that it's open to is a hymn that was written by Martin Luther. So again, referencing the Protestant Reformation. And then you may have noticed this kind of smudge in the in the center foreground. Now this is what's called an anthropomorphic skull, and it's meant to be seen very clearly from one angle. So if you actually shift your viewing to the right-hand side and kind of, if you're looking at your computer, Move to the right of your computer and look at it, and what you'll see is this actually flattens out, and it's a skull. It's an optical illusion. So why did Holbein put this in here? Was he basically just kind of like, hey, look at my skills? Maybe, could have been part of it. But what he's showing here, right, this is what's called a memento mori. A memento mori is a reminder of death. That here we are celebrating the greatness of man and all that man can accomplish, but he's reminding of us, again, through some of the more subtle things I just talked about, that there is still discord and disharmony at the time. But with this skull, this memento mori, he's reminding us of the great equalizer, that death comes for us all. We have not figured out how to escape death. And so it's almost a reminder to stay humble, that even though man is looking more and more to himself for the answers of the world, that at the end there is the great equalizer. Also, there's one last thing in here that also shows kind of this separation at the time. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see on the wall there's actually a crucifix hanging up there, and it's being covered up by the curtain. And so many scholars believe this is, again, a comment that man, this idea of reason, is literally covering up the faith, covering up the church itself. Again, some would say which is a reflection of the turmoil of the time. But I want you to know this painting, and I would be able to talk about it as a representation of the ideals of the Renaissance. Again, if you have questions about Renaissance humanism, let me know, because this is going to be a very important topic for your upcoming paper.